Hi everyone! Today I'm sewing up another free pattern. This is a peplum style blouse with a built-in shawl neckline, as well as a sash belt that's sewn into the garment. It really can make quite an elegant garment, but just like any pattern, you can make it as fancy or not fancy as you want depending on the fabric that you choose. This is the Tacoma blouse by Sewciety. It's a free pattern that you can download from their website. I've left the link below so that you can check it out, print it out, and sew it along with me today. Let's get started. You will need 2 shirt fronts mirrored, 1 shirt back cut on the fold, 2 front and collar pieces mirrored, 2 front peplums mirrored, 1 back peplum cut on the fold, 2 shirt ties, thin cording or elastic, and 1 button. Start by creating the belts. Fold each of your belt pieces right sides together the long way. Pin the long edge and 1 short edge. Sew your long edge and 1 short edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and do this for both belts. Once it's sewn, trim your seam allowance and clip the corners. And turn your belt right side out. And then give it a good press. And do that for both belts. Next, we're going to attach front and back pieces along the bottom curved side seams using French seams. So place your front piece on top of the back piece wrong sides together and pin or clip the side seam. And sew that side seam with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. Now that the side seam is sewn, I'm going to turn the garment so that it's facing right sides together and give this seam a really good press. Now that that seam is pressed nice and crisp, now I'm going to sew this seam once more with a 3/8 inch seam allowance now that it's right sides together. And now here's what your seam will look like on the inside, nice and enclosed. We'll also be sewing a French seam on the opposite side. So I've gone ahead and sewn the seam with a 1/8 inch seam allowance. But before I turn it right sides together and sew the 3/8 inch seam allowance, I'm going to stick the tie inside. I'm going to place the tie inside that seam, a 1/2 inch from the bottom of the garment, and once it's nicely nested in that seam, flip the front to the back so that they're right sides together, and pin or clip this seam in place. And now that that opposing seam is clipped in place, and my tie piece is also inside that seam, I'm going to finish up that French seam with my 3/8 inch seam allowance. And now your garment will look like this, with 2 nicely finished French seams on the inside, and on the outside of the garment, you have one of your ties extending from one of your side seams. And with these front and back pieces wrong sides together, clip these short shoulder seams, and sew them both with French seams, just as we did for the side seams. Now that I've finished my French seam on both shoulder seams, it will look like this, and you'll have this sharp corner here where the shoulder seam meets the shawl area. We're going to clip into this corner at a 45-degree angle from the corner of the seam to the stitching that we ended with at the shoulder. Do this at both of those inner shoulder shawl corners. This clipping at that corner will allow the shawl to lay nicely at the shoulder seam and alleviate any awkward tightness right there. Here are the top edges of my shawl pieces, and here is my neckline. I'm going to place these shawl pieces right sides together and sew them with a regular seam, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then press that seam open. And then we're going to sew the neckline to the shawl, again using a regular seam, placing them right sides together, pinning, and sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You'll start sewing right where your stitching for your shoulder seam ended, all the way to the same stitches on the opposite side. Then you get a nice and straight transition in your stitches. Place your 2 shawl pieces right sides together. Clip along the longer seam. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. Now grab your second tie piece. We're going to attach it to the bottom of the garment at the opposite side from where our first tie is attached. Place this second tie right sides together with this bottom end, a 1/2 inch from the bottom just as before, and pin our clip in place. And then place your facing right sides together with your garment. Start pinning in place, making sure to sandwich that second tie in between, and matching those top seams at the neckline, and continuing all the way to the opposite side of the garment. And continue pinning all along the top edge all around that facing. And then sew your facing to the shawl and front edge of the garment all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim your entire seam allowance. And turn your facing right side out. And then give that outer seam that we just sewed a really good press all the way around. Once that outer edge of your shawl and bodice are nicely pressed, we want to finish the inside edges of this facing. To do that, we're going to do a rolled hem. I'm going to take it to my iron and fold the raw edge of that facing to the inside by 1/2 inch all the way around, giving it a really good press. Then I'm going to take that portion of the facing that I've pressed to the inside and roll the raw edge to the crease, and then again on the crease, and pin our clip in place. Continue rolling your hem all the way around. Once you're done pinning that rolled hem all the way around the raw edge of your facing, take it to your sewing machine and sew close to the inner fold of your rolled hem all the way around. And now that that raw edge of our facing is nicely finished with the rolled hem, we're going to turn it to the inside of the garment. I'm going to take my facing and cover that seam so that it just covers the stitches I made when sewing the shawl to the neckline, and pin in place. Matching center seams all the way to the shoulder seam points and then stop. Directions say to slip stitch the facing along the neckline, but I'm going to sew from the outside, stitching in the ditch of the seam that I just pinned my facing to, from shoulder seam to shoulder seam. Here's the outside of my garment at the neckline where I've stitched in the ditch so that you can't see the stitches that's attaching the inside to the facing. And here's the inside of the garment at the neckline where the rolled hem is covering the seam. Now let's work on our peplum. Take your front and back peplum pieces and place them wrong sides together along the long seams. Pin our clip in place. And now sew both seams with French seams. Now that they're attached at the side seams, we're going to finish the outer edge of our peplum using a rolled hem, just as we did for the inner facing. I've gone ahead and pressed all the outer edges to the inside of the garment by 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to roll that hem in on itself to conceal the raw edges and clip all the way around. Sew close to that inner fold all the way around. Now I've finished rolling my hem all the way around my peplum. Now I'm ready to attach the peplum to the bodice. Place your peplum and your main bodice wrong sides together along the bottom edge, matching your center backs, side seams, and center fronts. And then continue pinning all the way across. Note that once you get to the ends where your belts are, you are sandwiching the bottom of the facing between the peplum and the bodice. And now sew your peplum to your bodice with a French seam. So here's my blouse so far, with the peplum nicely attached. All that's left to be done is to hem the sleeves with a rolled hem and add our button and button loop. I cut my piece of cording to a length of about 2.5 inches, and I'm going to sew it into the inner side seam on the same side of my garment where my belt is sewn into the outer corner. I'm going to open that side up and fold my cording into a loop. I'm going to sew this cording loop to this French seam, right above the stitching that I created when I attached the peplum to the bodice. So go ahead and stitch your cording to the French seam so that the stitches are not visible from the outside. Stitch back and forth a few times to secure. Once that loop is secured in the inner seam, grab the opposite corner of your bodice, the edge that will be tucked inside around your waist when you tie your belt, and sew your button to the edge of the garment right above your peplum. And now the very last step is to hem our sleeves. Take them to your ironing board, press the raw edge to the inside by 1/2 inch, and roll your hems just as we did for the bottom of the peplum. Do this for both sleeves and you'll be done with your blouse. Thank you so much for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing additions to your wardrobe. I'll see you in the next video.